She had $30, a trash bag, and nowhere to go. That's how one young woman described aging out of foster care. No goodbye party, no plan, just a plastic bag, a bus pass, and a warning not to come back. And if you've never heard that trash bag detail before, it shows up again and again because many kids in care, they don't leave with luggage. Their life gets handed to them in whatever's available. A bag you take to the curb becomes the thing that you carry your childhood in. That image isn't just sad, it's a clue. When a young person leaves care with no stable adult, no money, and nowhere to sleep, they don't just become at risk, they become easy to recruit. A few months later, another adult would step in, not a caseworker or a mentor, but a man in his 30s who called her beautiful, bought her dinner, and said, "You're my $1 million girl." Soon, he wasn't just buying her dinner, he was deciding who she saw and where she went. She thought she'd finally found someone who saw her. What she didn't realize was that he saw a business opportunity. I keep thinking about the distance between those two moments. How many missed calls sit in that gap? How many moves? How many adults who were technically in her life, but never really in her corner? The years of neglect, instability, and quiet messages about worth that made that line sound like love instead of a warning. I'm Bryce Butler, and this is Fracture to Flourish. If you're new here, last season we followed young people aging out of foster care and what it looked like when someone finally offered real belonging, not just services. Well, this season we're starting one step earlier, at the conditions that make foster youth such a common target for exploitation. We're tracing the link between foster care and human trafficking, how it happens, why it's so predictable, and what it would take to finally break it. One note before we begin. The stories you'll hear this season are real. We've changed or withheld some names and details to protect people's safety and privacy, and we're holding their stories with as much care as we can. This season includes accounts of abuse, exploitation, and trafficking involving children and families. We'll avoid gratuitous details, but the content may still be hard, especially for younger listeners or for those with similar experiences. If you're listening with kids or if this is close to your own story, you may want to preview episodes first or step away whenever you need to. When we talk about foster care, we usually picture the moment that the state steps in, a car in the driveway, a worker at the door. But the story itself starts way before that.
Perhaps the most hardy vulnerability factor is actually sex. And so females disproportionately are affected as victims than any other population.
That's Dr. Jeanne Allert, a researcher and practitioner who has spent years studying trafficking patterns across the country and is the founder of the Institute for Survivor Care.
The second most common characteristic of victims of sex trafficking in America is prior experience a victim of child sexual abuse. We saw in our population about 97% of the victims that we served had had that experience as a child. We're still seeing, as you look at the data nationally, it's in the 90 percentile that individuals have been molested as children, oftentimes at the hands of a family member, and that, if you will, starts a trajectory of abuse that continues. It is rare, if not trite, to imagine that somebody sort of walks out of their door at age 18 and then all of a sudden bad things happen.
What we start to understand is that for a lot of kids, exploitation doesn't begin with a trafficker. It begins with what's tolerated at home. An uncle who doesn't knock. A cousin chasing a high who knows exactly what a child is worth in cash. A parent so deep in their own wounds that they can't or won't see what's happening to their very own child. And then eventually, something crosses a line that cannot be explained away. For Lauren, who entered foster care at 9, stayed until 16, and was trafficked for 10 years, starting at 15, that moment at home was the tipping point. We're only using her first name here to help protect her privacy.
I was actually at home And it was another incident where police were called to my home for domestic violence. Child Protective Services had already told my mother if she goes back around her spouse at the time that, they would remove the children. So ultimately, she had a choice to either separate with him and no contact or her children. And she chose the man. And the very last incident before going to foster care, he had cut me with a knife while I was trying to break up a fight between him and my mother. He then cut himself. And when the police arrived, he was trying to tell the police that I cut him. The police were able to examine him and see that from the angles of the cuts and my height that I was not the one that did that. I was in the foster care system from about the 5th grade until my 9th grade year of high school.
When CPS shows up, there's an ultimatum, some paperwork, and a promise. We're here to keep you safe. On paper, it looks like protection. But in reality, it's the closing sentence of the first chapter. Years of domestic violence, drugs, and chaos, finally too visible to ignore. And the kids who carry all of that into foster care, well, they're not blank slates. They're already learning what love looks like and what they're worth. Entering foster care is one shock. Staying there is a series of smaller ones. When a child is in foster care, home can change overnight. On paper, the system calls it a placement change, a child being moved from one foster home to another, or from one group home to another, and back again. In a kid's life, that paperwork turns into a social worker at the door, a rushed goodbye, and everything they owned stuffed into a trash bag. It's car rides to new neighborhoods and new bedrooms that never quite feel like theirs.
My data has it that the average number of foster care placements in America is 11. From a child's perspective, they're not going to see it as I'm difficult. They're going to see it as that's 10 families who don't want me. And so if I've had that messaging of disenfranchisement, I'm going to keep looking for that somewhere else.
11 moves. For an adult, that might sound like logistics. But for a child, it sounds like I was given back again and again. Here's Lauren again.
So at 16 on, they gave custody back to my mother after she completed a series of classes and things that she had to do to get me back. And she would oftentimes tell me that the only reason she even got me back was because I had gotten a disability check and that she wanted my disability check. Shortly after moving back with her, I had a grown boyfriend, and eventually it led to me getting pregnant at 16 with my first child. I was mainly just staying with him or really wherever I wanted. Other than the woman that I really had liked to be with, and I consider her still like a mother to this day because she taught me, how to cook, how to clean, how to take care of myself as a woman, things that my mom had never taught me. She took me to church for the first time. I joined the choir with her. She really just gave me a great experience, and I love her still to this day.
Lauren remembers one foster mom who taught her how to cook, how to take care of herself, how to be seen. But she also remembers homes where she was just another check, where her stuff went missing, where nobody asked how she was doing, only whether she'd followed the rules. And what the brain learns from this is pretty simple. Stability is temporary. Adults are unreliable. You are on your own. Counter-trafficking specialist Ashlee Lucas works at the systems level with the Tebow Group. For years, she's watched the same pattern in Mississippi and beyond. It looks something like this. A young person enters foster care, gets moved so often that every placement feels temporary, and they start to feel invisible. They run, and then meet someone online who offers exactly the affirmation and stability that the system never did.
That repeated runaway, the missing from care, frequent absences, new possessions, vague stories, an older partner, a much older boyfriend, gifts, constant contact, seen as normal, like just as normal relationship or romance. They think they're in a relationship. Behavioral changes, when someone is actually being trafficked, they could have withdrawal, they could have anger. When I trained teachers and superintendents and educators throughout Mississippi, one of the things I would talk to them about is their behavior is their communication. The kids that are acting out the most are having the most happen to them. And so instead of being punitive, let's be compassionate and get to the why this behavior is occurring.
Ashlee sees that as a pipeline the adults can trace, but the kids inside it can't. To them, it isn't a system. It's a series of least bad options, leaving one unstable place for another that seems safer, answering a DM that finally feels like being chosen. In Season 1, we met Christabella, a young woman who aged out of foster care and did what so many young people do when the system lets go. She tried to build a life on her own. She had an apartment, and then an older boyfriend entered the picture. Drugs followed, and before long, what started as survival slid into exploitation, prostitution, and eventually prison. You're going to hear a short moment from her here because her story sits right in the gap that we're describing, the space between the system is done with you and someone else steps in.
Started out with a boy. Back then I was very insecure. I had low self-esteem. The first guy that called me pretty, my pants was down. The first guy that noticed me, I was 18 years old and I ended up getting with a 32-year-old. By this time, I'm a full-blown heroin, fentanyl, methamphetamine junkie. I ended up prostituting. I got into it. A friend told me about it and I saw like how much easy money she was making, all that. And also like, it's kind of sick, but the companionship and where you feel in control, it's like you have some type of power. But I think that's what it was companionship. I was never alone. I made easy money and I felt like I was in control. And I've never been in control ever when I was in foster care and all that. Everybody else was in control.
At the time, no one used the word trafficking for what Christabella was living through. It was just a girl aging out of foster care, bouncing between couches, and trying to survive. She told us that the first time a man called her pretty, she didn't hesitate. Not because she wanted to have sex, but because in a strange way, sex for money sometimes felt like the only place that she could find a kind of closeness that she wasn't getting anywhere else. When attention, touch, and the words, "you're beautiful," only ever show up inside abuse, they don't feel like red flags. They feel like the closest thing to intimacy that you've ever had. Season 1 showed us what belonging can heal. In Season 2, we begin to see what happens when belonging never had a chance. There's a phrase that comes up a lot in this work, falling through the cracks. It sounds small, like there's this tiny gap somewhere in the floor. But the reality is closer to a fault line that runs through families. Tori Hope Peterson grew up in foster care. If you only saw her life from the outside, you might file her story under the success case. She was adopted into a loving family. She made it to college. She went on to build a national platform, writing books, speaking, and telling the truth about foster care to rooms full of people. But that's the polished version that you see at the end. The beginning is messier. And is exactly why we're telling this story in a season about trafficking. Not because Tori was trafficked, but because trafficking doesn't just harm one person, it ripples outward. Into families, into parenting, into mental health, into the moments where a child ends up in the system. Before Tori became someone with a microphone, she was a kid trying to survive inside the same fault lines that we've been talking about: family trauma, instability, and adults who were supposed to protect her, but couldn't, or didn't. In Tori's case, the trafficking story that shaped her childhood was her mother's.
So that first time I was in foster care, I was actually reunified with my biological mom. And at that time, I was really happy to be with my biological mom. Mom always communicated that she loved me, was very provided for in my perspective. And from what I could understand at that age, 3 and 4, I felt safe. But as I got older and as time went on, my mom's mental health sadly got significantly worse. My mom actually is a human trafficking survivor. Because of that, I think that the trauma that she's never had the resources, all the resources that are available today. And sadly, she passed on a lot of that trauma. And so I re-entered the foster care system at the age of 12, this time with my biological sister, who is like 9.5 years younger than me. My feelings were completely different when I went to the foster care system the second time. I was quite relieved, actually. I thought, okay, this is going to be our chance at having a safe family. This is going to be our chance where the abuse is going to end, the chaos is going to go away. But really, we're just entering into a different kind of chaos. I noticed quite quickly there was abuse that occurred in that first home, and my sister and I were separated because when I reported it, they said that I was lying. I went to a residential group home. I was quite angry that I was there and I felt very bitter, but I was offered therapy and counseling, and I realized now that I was like, I really needed it. It was mandatory while living there that everyone who lived there did therapy and counseling. We did group therapy. And it was through a lot of those experiences that I think I started to process my story.
Tori holds both ends of the system at once, a parent who is trafficked and a child who ends up in foster care as a result. And this is one of the through lines of this season, that trafficking is not only something that happens to an individual, it changes what a family can carry. Trauma doesn't stay neatly contained in one body or one chapter. It shows up in mental health and relationships, in the ability to parent, in the difference between a home that's safe and a home that's chaos. So sometimes the foster care to trafficking story starts even earlier than a placement change or a runaway report. Sometimes it starts with a parent who is exploited and a child who inherits the fallout.
One of the labels that I distinctly remember and that probably will never leave me was after I reported the abuse in the first foster home and they determined that I was lying, they put in my file that I was hard to place. And that's why I had to go to the residential group home. I knew that after that, that label or those ideas around me would make it harder and harder for me to be a part of a family. And my biological mom, I love her dearly, and I will always say that she did the absolute best with what she had. But I think a lot of people, when they hear about the abuse, they think that that was the most hurtful. But when I look back, it was the words that she spoke over me that were the most hurtful. I was conceived out of rape. And so I remember there was this time my mom, and I know now again that she said these things because of her own trauma, but she told me that I was the spitting image of a rapist. That still marks me because in my adulthood, all I've wanted is to be a good mom and protect children. And so when someone speaks that over you, or when that's a part of your identity in some way, I think I always question, like, is this my inheritance? All the dysfunction, all the pain that's caused to me, it's running on both sides of my family. How could it not fall onto me? It's always been a great fear.
Even in the comparatively good placement, those labels can hurt. Hard to place. Problem kid. Not really part of the family. The system's language becomes the story that you tell yourself. And those stories don't just shape self-esteem. They shape what a child thinks is reportable. If you've been told you're dramatic or difficult or lying, you learn pretty quickly which truth gets you punished and which truth just gets ignored. And this is where it gets complicated, because foster care sits in the middle of abuse and trafficking in more than one way. Sometimes kids enter care because something terrible was happening at home. Violence, neglect, sexual abuse, and removal is the first real attempt to interrupt it. Sometimes harm happens inside the system, in bad placements, in group settings, in the moments when a kid is bounced around and no one is watching closely enough. And sometimes the trafficking comes after, not because foster care caused it, but because instability can leave a young person isolated, labeled, and hungry for a safe person who will not leave. Different pathways, same destination. An overlooked teen with a thinning sense of belonging. And predators are very good at noticing exactly that. When you don't feel like you belong anywhere, attention can feel like rescue, control can feel like love, and secrecy can feel normal, which is why it matters who has access first. Before there's a trafficker in a parking lot or a DM in a phone, there's often an adult already inside the circle. Someone who can use the language of family to get compliance, to buy silence, to keep a child from being believed. Here's Dr. Allert again.
The phenomenon of familial trafficking really came to us gradually. Piecing together some points, I started to go, well, wait a second, I think that there's more to this story on the nefarious side, not just on the sad, but in this example, that person might be an agent of this 17-year-old's abuse. So in 20 and 21, I embarked on a national study. And what we found just in the data alone was that 26% of those were trafficked at the hands of their family members. Most often, 60 to 64% of the time, it's the biological mother. That is not necessarily the biological mother inflicting the sexual abuse. That is the biological mother perpetrating the crime by providing access to the child. But that was in 21 that we published that study. Since then, now we're seeing with much more harmony that it's in the low 30s. Around 43% is where we're seeing familial trafficking as a experience prior to third-party exploitation. So that presents all kinds of complications for us. And some of those studies have been where the familial trafficking was a foster relationship. So it can be biological. Some states call it caregiver trafficking to expand into those other relationships, but it's whoever has that custodial responsibility for the child. So that, I think, is a huge wake-up call in the United States, because we want to beat the drum through our media of, oh, gee, it's an over-there problem, or it's an immigration problem, or it's a transnational problem, or it's a multinational gang problem. And that makes for great theater, but statistically, if 40% of our trafficking victims here in America were first trafficked by a family member, then we have a very different and much more localized problem.
Dr. Allert's research shows that in a huge share of child trafficking cases, the first person to profit from a child's body isn't a stranger. It's a parent, a mom's boyfriend, a grandparent, someone with keys to the front door. That means a lot of kids meet their first trafficker across the dinner table, not at a bus station.
But I firmly believe that if we're going to honestly deal with trafficking, sex trafficking here in America, we have got to deal with childhood sexual abuse, the exploitation of children at the hands of the very people who are supposed to take care of them. If that's 40% of the adults who were, when they were kids, it was their own family. Now you fast forward that and you say, do you want to go to a family?
If we're honest, that's the part we don't like to look at. It's easier to imagine bad guys outside than to admit that in our own communities, exploitation is often a family business, built on secrets and silence. Now, layer that on top of everything we've already talked about: high caseloads, social workers cycling out, schools missing red flags, and a pattern emerges. These aren't just kids who were abused and then removed from their homes. They're kids who were abused, removed, and then never truly seen. All of this, who ends up in foster care, how often they move, how invisible they feel, it doesn't happen in a vacuum. John Richmond is one of the country's leading voices on human trafficking, a former U.S. ambassador at large whose work has shaped how governments and advocates respond to exploitation, and is now the Chief Impact Officer with Atlas Free, a nonprofit that works around the world to prevent trafficking and support survivors through local, community-based partners. When he looks at foster care, he doesn't see random tragedies. He says it's the product of how we built the system in the first place.
There had been expressions of foster care since the middle of the 1800s, small philanthropy groups trying to care for people in their communities. But what we saw in the United States was a fairly rapid transition. What we saw in the 1950s was a series of investigative journalism and exposés that highlighted the abuses that were happening in orphanages. And it had a massive response on the American public. And within 10 years, we basically saw all of the orphanages shut down and a new investment of government funding into a foster care system in the 1960s. Well, what we didn't have was a plan. We knew we wanted to move away from orphanages. The foster care system, as embryonic as it was at that point, was the next best thing. But we never set out and designed a system to care for children who don't have families or whose families are not safe. And I think the challenge that we have now is we have just continued to allow it to grow. But what we haven't done is invested in true strategic planning and enough resources that could actually build a system that could care for the 350 to sometimes over 400,000 year by year number of kids in the United States that are in foster care. And at this point, we've seen almost a complete disappearance of the orphanage system. There are some rehabilitation homes or safe homes and things like that that operate on a much smaller scale. But the orphanage model itself is largely gone, not just from America, but from other Western countries as well.
We shut down orphanages in less than a decade, but we never really sat down and designed what should replace them.
One of the challenges is sort of this permanent temporary foster care system, where kids are going through multiple temporary placements over the course of their time in the system that creates an amazing amount of instability and vulnerability. And they're vulnerable to all sorts of things, but they're certainly vulnerable to traffickers. And we know that traffickers are intentionally targeting kids in foster care. I talked to one trafficker, and as he was explaining to me his recruitment model, he told me he just would spend time outside social services centers looking for the next 13-year-old that had bounced through 10 foster care homes. And so we know that they're intentionally targeting kids in foster care. And we know that a very common experience for many of the survivors that we've talked to is that they have experienced some period of time in the foster care system. Traffickers generally want to use the least amount of coercion necessary to control or to compel someone to engage in commercial sex or some type of legitimate labor. And so they're intentionally targeting folks that they think are vulnerable. Now, the vulnerability itself doesn't cause the trafficking, but we know traffickers are targeting the vulnerable people because they think they're easier to exploit. And that's why we see them going to foster care. One trafficker explained it to me as, I just try to figure out what people want, what they love, what their dream is. As soon as I figure that out, I sell them that dream.
John describes traffickers literally waiting outside social services offices, watching which kids come in again and again, learning that the more times a child is moved, the easier it will be to sell them a different version of family. John's story of how foster care was built for crisis and not for kids is something we'll come back to later this season. In episode 3, we'll trace what that lack of design looks like, line by line, inside of one child's case file. In season 1, there was a theme that we kept returning to, a young person describing the first adult who didn't walk away. Not the program, not the policy, the person.
But if there's no fundamental relationship in that youth's life in which they feel that they belong, that they are valued for themselves, for who they are, rather than as a person on a caseload or someone who's being paid to coach them. If they don't have that baseline foundation that I belong in this world because there are people who want me here and I matter and I bring something of value to them, it's part of being human, will seek out a version of that that's unhealthy because it's better than nothing.
All of this is why people like Dr. Jennifer Jacobs are rethinking foster care from the inside. She leads Connect Our Kids, a nonprofit using technology to help youth in care find and stay connected to family. Drawing on years of systems-level work in government and national security, she talks about what happens when a relationship vacuum opens up for a young person, and why if safe adults don't fill that space, something or someone else will. Now here is Dr. Allert again.
And I think we've taken a very adult view, meaning what an adult would need to the recovery of what a child needs. Our research is showing that when we're tending to adult survivors, we have to focus on sometimes very practical issues like employment and sobriety and their stability in the community. And those are sort of life skills things. But when you talk to children and you understand what they need to move forward, it is first and foremost relationship. It's not the practical of, can we get them in school? It's, do I have relationship? There's part of that we have to look at that and go, well, that's obvious. But for a child, that dependency, that interdependency, that relational connection, they will subjugate all other needs for the value of that relationship. If I have to give you this in order to have protection and security, then that's a small price to pay. Dr. Judy Herman says that we have to understand that a child will organize all of their psychological defenses around preserving that one critical relationship. If the person who is abusing me, trafficking me, is my mother, I will reorganize my world and the way I interpret my world to make that make sense, to make that make okay. And I will defend that relationship at all costs. But what we want as adults is we want children to testify, which means betray the relationship.
Dr. Allert puts it starkly. Kids will reorganize their whole world to protect one critical relationship, even if that relationship is also what's hurting them. And that helps explain something we'll see throughout this season. Why youth stay with traffickers, why they return to homes that weren't safe, and why the statement, just leave, misses the point. Because belonging isn't a bonus feature, it's infrastructure. And if healthy adults don't build it, predators will rent it out by the hour. So that's where we're going to start this season. Not with a raid, not with a courtroom. We're starting with a plastic trash bag. Because that's what the system hands some of these kids when it's time to move on. Not a suitcase, not a closet full of things that have stayed put, but a bag that says, pack fast, don't take up space, don't get too attached. And for a lot of young people, that lesson doesn't end when childhood ends. It just changes form. It becomes a new placement and another fresh start that isn't fresh at all. It becomes a file that follows you, even when the adults who wrote it don't. It becomes a promise made in a hallway. I'll call you back. I'll show up. I'll fix it. I won't leave. And then the silence that comes after. It becomes the kind of words that kids learn to memorize. The ones said in anger. The ones said in court. The ones said casually, like they don't stick. Hard to place. Dramatic. Lying. When you grow up inside that language, you start to wonder what counts as love and what you're allowed to need. Because trauma is not just something a person survives. It's something a family can inherit. It travels through relationships, through mental health, through what a home feels like. It can land a child in foster care before that child ever knows the word trafficking. And then the system, overwhelmed, under-resourced, stretched thin, asks that child to keep trusting adults anyways. So when an older boyfriend shows up with a phone, a ride, a couch, a plan, it doesn't feel like danger. It feels like the first person who doesn't make you pack, the first person who doesn't send you back, the first person who says, you can stay. In episode 2, we're going to define the crime itself, what trafficking actually is, how it shows up in our own towns, and how it shows up in DMs, on phones, in the quiet hours when nobody's watching. We're going to sit inside of that lie, I'll be your boyfriend, long enough to understand why it works. Not because kids are naive, because so many have been trained over and over that love is something you earn. If episode 1 explains why kids become the perfect target, episode 2 explains who's waiting there to take the shot and how technology widens the net. Fracture to Flourish is a production of Access Ventures. Created, written, and hosted by me, Bryce Butler. Editing and production by Jacob Bozart. Additional editing and production by Crystal Esquivel and Amelia Witz. Audio mixing by Pat Kicklighter. Cover art and design by Justin Esquivel. Marketing support by Amelia Witz and Madison Butler. And I want to extend a special thanks to our partners at Scarlet Hope and Atlas Free. Links are in the show notes. You can find show notes and resources mentioned on this episode on our website, fracturetoflourish.com. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, rate, and review. Your feedback is greatly appreciated. Thank you for listening.